Welcome. Welcome to the legislative hearing on the legislation to respond to the BP oil spill and to prevent future oil well blowouts. 5,000 feet below the Gulf of Mexico in dark, frigid waters lies an ineffectual, inert steel structure 5 stories high. A few hundred miles from the spill's source, a hurricane is barreling through the Gulf, disrupting the response to the disaster. These two events are emblematic of BP and the oil industry's lack of attention to safety and inadequate response capabilities for a catastrophic spill. The Gulf of Mexico response plan for BP includes walruses, which haven't called the region home for 3 million years. Yet, if you look for the word hurricane in their response plan, you won't find it in BP's contingency plans. Over the course of the past 2 months, the Energy and Commerce Committee has conducted a vigorous investigation of the causes of the BP Deepwater Horizon disaster. We have held numerous hearings in this subcommittee and in the Oversight and Investigations Subcommittee. We have worked hard to uncover the truth about the causes of the disaster, in part to ensure that the responsible parties are held fully accountable. But it is equally important, if not more so, that we use the knowledge we have gained about the BP Deepwater Horizon disaster to ensure that such a thing will never happen again. That is what today's hearing is all about. The committee's investigation has raised serious concerns about the adequacy of industry practices and regulatory standards with regard to oil and gas drilling. As the ongoing catastrophe in the Gulf of Mexico makes clear, the stakes could hardly be higher. Nor is this an isolated incident. In 1979, the Ixtoc blowout in the Gulf of Mexico and the 2009 blowout in Australia both involved shallow water wells and caused massive environmental damage. This subcommittee, because of its jurisdiction over energy exploration and production, has a responsibility to address this critical issue. That is why full committee chairman Henry Waxman, Chairman Bart Stupak, and I yesterday introduced the Blowout Prevention Act, or BP Act, of 2010. Historically, regulation of offshore drilling has required the use of best available, safest technologies, taking costs into account. But regulators have had little or no congressional guidance on what this standard requires. And current regulations plainly are not adequate. The bill now before the subcommittee responds to this gap by establishing minimum standards for well drilling technologies and practices for offshore and other high-risk wells. The legislation is built on the basic concept of defense in depth. It requires multiple lines of defense against a blowout and ensures that these defenses are redundant so that failure of one does not lead to cascading failures of the entire system, as occurred with BP's Macondo well. First, the legislation sets minimum standards for blowout preventers, the last line of defense against a blowout like the one that occurred on April 20th. These standards require that blowout preventer mechanisms to seal wells in the event of an emergency are effective and redundant. The legislation also requires new standards governing well design and cementing to ensure multiple redundant barriers within the well against uncontrolled oil or gas flow that could lead to a blowout. The BP Act also includes a number of provisions to improve regulatory oversight of high-risk wells. It requires periodic updating of regulatory standards and establishes an independent technical advisory committee to help ensure that safety standards are adequate. The legislation also requires independent third-party certification of blowout preventers and well designs and establishes whistleblower protections for rig workers. And finally, it requires periodic and unannounced inspections and establishes strict civil and criminal penalties. This bill is not written in stone. It is the beginning of a process. We look forward to the input of our witnesses today and to working with our colleagues on both sides of the aisle to improve this legislation. and move it forward through the legislative process. I now turn to recognize the ranking member of the subcommittee, the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Upton, for his opening statement.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. The BP spill is an environmental and economic disaster on a scale that we've never seen before. We need to ensure to the best of our ability that such a disaster cannot and does not happen again. Our domestic energy resources power our economy and keeps America working. The oil industry is under the microscope now for sure, and they should be. We need to learn from this accident, make any needed changes, and then move forward. Clearly, in light of what happened on Deepwater Horizon rig, new safety and oversight regulations are needed. But the question still remains, what actions are necessary to improve safety without blocking our much-needed domestic reserves? I look forward to working on a bipartisan piece of legislation that ensures the safety and effectiveness of offshore drilling. A joint investigation into the cause of the Deepwater Horizon blowout, explosion, and spill are currently being conducted by the Coast Guard and MMS. In addition, President Obama announced a presidential commission that will investigate the relevant facts and circumstances concerning the root causes of the Deepwater Horizon's explosion, fire, and oil spill, and develop options to guard against and mitigate the impact of any oil spills associated with offshore drilling in the future. I agree that we need to investigate, get to the bottom of what really happened, and develop new standards based on the lessons learned. However, the Coast Guard investigation is not complete, and the President's Commission has yet to meet. I'm all for improving the safety of offshore drilling, but we should wait for the investigations to be concluded before we prematurely pass legislation that may not improve safety and could possibly make matters worse. We should call a hearing when they've completed the investigation to hear what they've discovered. Legislating deepwater drilling safety must be a bipartisan basis, and we must develop sound science and actual evidence and conclusions from that ongoing investigation. In addition to my practical concerns about legislating before the Presidential Commission has even met, there are a few troubling provisions in the draft legislation that we're looking at today that I fear will serve as a de facto drilling ban for both offshore and onshore wells, oil and natural gas. Legislation that prevents us from safely developing our domestic oil and natural gas resources would be catastrophic to our economy, destroying potentially tens of thousands of jobs almost overnight, and would severely weaken our national security as we import more and more oil and gas from abroad. Specifically, the legislation defines a high-risk well so broadly that it covers nearly every offshore and onshore oil and natural gas well. Clearly, we should be using a scientific definition that relies on sound engendering principles. Not every well is high risk. Additionally, the legislation requires a standard of certification that equals a 100% standard. Nothing in our lives is up to a 100% certainty standards. Risks are everywhere, from crossing the street to getting into a car, flying on a plane, installing a windmill off the shore of Nantucket, even riding in an elevator. If we're going to require an unattainable list of certification before we allow otherwise safe drilling to occur, let's at least be honest with the American people and call the legislation what it really is, a ban on American-made energy. I do have some other concerns with the content of the draft, but I'll end here so we can hear from our witnesses. We have a lot at stake. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. The chair recognizes the chairman of the full committee, the gentleman from California, Mr. Waxman.
Chairman Markey, I want to thank you for today's hearing on the Blowout Prevention Act of 2010. We're now more than 2 months into this largest environmental disaster in U.S. history. 11 workers are dead. The Macondo well continues to pour thousands of barrels of oil into the Gulf of Mexico each day. BP's cleanup effort continues to be inadequate, and an entire way of life along the Gulf Coast is being threatened. It's time for Congress to act. Investigations are ongoing and will continue to tell us more about the causes of this accident, but we know enough already to begin crafting legislative solutions. And I want to disagree with my colleague from Michigan. If we don't know enough to start fashioning legislative solutions, then I don't think we know enough to start drilling, which I hear many of our colleagues on the other side of the aisle insist that we do. Why should we allow more drilling if we can't assure that the drilling is going to be done safely and there's a plan in place that could clean up any oil spill should that happen. Thanks to this subcommittee and Chairman Stupak's Subcommittee on Oversight, this disaster, as we've seen in our investigation, could have been prevented. BP made a series of risky decisions before the explosion that destroyed the Deepwater Horizon. These decisions saved time and money for BP, but increased the risks of a catastrophic blowout. When BP CEO Tony Hayward appeared before the Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigations, we asked him to explain these decisions. He tried to dodge responsibility, telling us repeatedly he was not involved in the decisions, and he tried to shift blame to others. BP chose a risky well design on the Macondo well that provided minimal barriers to prevent dangerous gases from flowing to the wellhead. They ignored their contractor's advice about how to properly cement the well. They failed to conduct a critical cement test, and they failed to properly circulate well fluids. The legislation we're considering would set strict new requirements to ensure that these basic well control guidelines cannot be ignored at any high-risk well. BP says it relied on the well's blowout preventer as the last line of defense, but we know that blowout preventers are not foolproof, not even close. They can't shear pipe to seal the well if there's not a tool joint, if there's a tool joint or other obstruction preventing blind shear rams from closing. They don't have appropriate redundancy built in. Too often a single problem can cause systematic blowout preventer failure, and blowout preventers and their emergency control systems are not adequately tested once they are put in place. This proposed law would fix these problems. It requires redundant systems to shut down runaway wells. It requires third-party testing to make sure blowout preventers will work when needed, and it establishes a new aggressive oversight and testing regime with unannounced site visits by federal regulators. BP took advantage of a lack of resources and a failure in the regulatory culture at the Minerals Management Service. The agency handed over too much authority, relying on the industry to police itself. This self-policing approach can work only if everybody behaves responsibly. All it takes is one bad actor, one well that falls behind schedule, and one too many corners cut before the disaster results. The legislation before the committee sets out to change this culture of complacency. It requires the appropriate regulator to set tough standards and create a committee of independent experts to check their work and make sure they do their jobs. The independent committee must review available technologies, assess industry practices and regulations, and provide the best, most up-to-date technical and regulatory advice so that we have the best possible set of rules for drilling high-risk wells. It's too late to stop the explosion and blowout on the Deepwater Horizon, but we can continue our work to determine what happened and hold the appropriate parties accountable and make sure that this type of catastrophic blowout never happens again. This legislation is an important first step to ensuring drilling safety at high-risk wells, and I look forward to hearing our witnesses' views on the matter and to working on a bipartisan basis on this legislation. We need to make sure that we act decisively and rapidly in response to the disaster in the Gulf. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Great. We thank the gentleman. The chair recognizes the ranking member of the full committee, the gentleman from the state of Texas, Mr. Barton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before I give my opening statement, I do want to congratulate my friends on the Democrat side for their victory last night in the congressional baseball game. In spite of the best efforts of Mr. Scalise and Mr. Shimkus and several others on this committee on the R side, the D side won. It was 4-4 going into the top of the seventh, and then we had our own spill of errors and malfunctions, and our blowout preventer didn't work very well. The final score was 13-5, so my hats are off to my friends on the Democratic side, and my heart goes out to all of the folks on my side who worked so hard for the game. I'll be happy to. We'll work on it. Anyway, Mr. Chairman, I have a formal opening statement I'm going to submit for the record. I just want to summarize to say that we have had a strong offshore drilling safety record in the Gulf of Mexico. This is the first major spill. Unfortunately, it's a very catastrophic spill, both in terms of loss of life, in terms of amount of environmental damage, and also economic damage. So no one is happy about that. I think the bipartisan investigation that this committee is conducting is uncovering the facts. I would agree with what I think Chairman Waxman said just now, that this was probably a preventable accident. I would also agree that it doesn't appear that BP followed best practices in terms of industry, and I would also agree that those best practices need to be updated and improved so that if at all possible we don't let this happen again. I would point out that while it's important for Congress to act, and I think myself and all Republicans are prepared to work in a bipartisan basis on this bill, it's better to do it right than to do it fast. This draft bill is a work in progress. There are some things in it that I think are very positive. The third-party testing idea, I think, is a good idea. I do believe, though, that the citizen suit provision in the bill is problematic. I'm not sure that we want to do a citizen suit for this type of an activity. And I think, as Mr. Upton pointed out in his opening statement, we need to work on the definition of what a high-risk well is, as currently drafted. The high risk could be construed to be every well that's potentially drilled in the United States, both onshore and offshore. And having said that, we want to improve safety procedures. We want to make it possible to continue drilling both in an environmentally safe and an economically positive way in the Gulf of Mexico and the other OCS areas. So we stand ready to work in a bipartisan basis to see if the draft before us can be improved so that it can be supported. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back. I do want to point out that Mr. Waxman has scheduled a markup downstairs, so that some of us are going to have to be running back and forth to the other subcommittee markup. But we look forward to hearing from our witnesses and hearing the testimony. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Washington State. I'm sorry. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Washington State, Mr. Inslee.
Thank you. I just want to reiterate Mr. Waxman's comments that while we may not know the exact mechanism of this failure, we do know that there were multiple stop signs that BP ran through that could have resulted in this failure. So we are prepared to legislate in this regard and should do in a prompt and reasonable manner. I just want to say there are three things I hope we will consider in this draft. Number one, I hope that we will consider bringing to this industry the same level of safety and engineering expertise that we enjoy in the aviation industry. The FAA provides us a template about how to insist on using engineering to achieve statistical probabilities of success. And I believe in this draft we should add a provision that will make sure that we have an engineering system analysis of every system involved in deep shore drilling that will reach statistical probability of success. We don't have that now, and I hope that we'll consider adding that to this draft. Second, I hope we will consider beefing up the provisions on what the requirements are for using the best available technology. We simply need to use the best available technology in this industry, given the enormous risk entailed in deepwater drilling. We should make that a requirement. We'll be offering amendments in that regard. The third is we've got to make sure we use remote triggering devices for these blowout preventers. Other nations do this. It's a requirement that we should have and I look forward to working on this legislation.
Chair recognizes Mr. Mr. Pitts for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for holding this hearing on legislation written in response to the BP oil spill. The oil spill is a tragic event in the history of our country. Not only have lives been lost, but massive amounts of oil have been leaked into the ocean, causing horrible effects, some of which we know now and some of which will take years to discover. First and foremost, the leakage of the oil must be stopped. The environmental damage must be repaired. And in addition, it is imperative that we thoroughly understand what happened aboard Deepwater Horizon before, during, and after the explosion. We must know what caused this horrific event so that it will never happen again. It is of utmost importance that due diligence is done by those investigating the root causes of the Deepwater Horizon blowout explosion. While we acknowledge the need to focus on drilling safety and ensuring the response of blowout preventers, I'm concerned that we're considering the bill before us today before the joint investigation has been completed. While we're in the process of finding out what exactly happened, I think it would be wise for this body to use caution from trying to come up with a solution that may or may not fix safety concerns. As we move forward, I hope that the approach of this committee is prudent and measured. We need to promote drilling safety, yet at the same time, we want to do this with knowing all the facts, with a thorough knowledge of what is broken and the expertise on how to fix it. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today, and I yield back.
Chair recognizes Mr. Butterfield for 2 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Let me start by thanking Chairman Markey for his relentless pursuit of the truth during this great tragedy. I say it is not premature for us to begin the process of legislating and addressing this terrible tragedy. From the beginning, Chairman Markey has asked tough questions, he has demanded transparency, and exercised his full authority to investigate the blowout on the Deepwater Horizon rig. His work has produced tremendous insight into BP's failure to exercise due care. The American people deserve oil and gas companies that self-regulate out of respect for the safety of their employees and the environmental sustainability of their surroundings. Unfortunately, as the facts continue to come into clear view, it appears that the financial bottom line, not the safety or the concern over environmental risk, was the primary concern. This is an enormous tragedy. All of us agree on that. But it necessitates a thorough review and, yes, an overhaul of our regulatory strategy. The draft under discussion today begins the conversation. It is not an end point. It begins that conversation. We begin knowing that federal officials lack the needed power to require the best technologies and practices, and knowing that the technology of high-risk drilling has far outpaced the rulemaking to provide the public with security and certainty. We begin by playing catch-up today. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Mr. Scalise for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Over 2 months after the onset of the Deepwater Horizon disaster, oil continues to pour into the Gulf and invade our coastal wetlands. If this catastrophe has taught us anything, it is that we must focus on offshore drilling safety. We must bring together engineers and scientists to develop safety improvement strategies so that a disaster like the Horizon never happens again. I think it's worth noting that the President and his administration discarded the advice and safety recommendations of their own panel of experts and engineers in the initial 30-day safety report in order to pursue a 6-month drilling ban that those same experts say will actually jeopardize the long-term safety of offshore energy exploration. Instead of focusing on safety, some in Congress are more interested in pursuing their own political agendas than addressing the issues we're battling in the Gulf. This takes our focus away from where it should be, on improving the safety of our domestic energy production. The Oil Pollution Act of 1990 states that the President shall ensure effective and immediate removal of a discharge. On numerous occasions, the President has said that from day one, he has been on the ground and in charge. But if that is the case, where was the President when state and local officials waited nearly a month for approval of a plan to construct sand berms and protect our valuable marsh? And after approving only a small portion of the plan, why did the administration's bureaucrats recently halt construction of these critical berms for nearly a week while oil continued to pour into our wetlands. If Congress really was interested in helping us, pass legislation that actually helps us. If there's anything we should all agree on, it's that our first priority and our focus needs to be on capping the well and protecting the Gulf Coast from the oil. And to be clear, this bill does absolutely nothing to stop the oil or solve the problems we're battling. Of course, we all want to improve the safety of offshore energy production, but this bill as it stands now seems like a Trojan horse to shut down domestic energy production both offshore and on. And make no mistake, shutting down domestic energy production will ship millions of American jobs overseas and will leave our country more vulnerable to oil spills from even more imported oil. We need to continue the investigations into the explosion and sinking of the Horizon to make sure that this type of tragedy doesn't happen again. But some people in this town seem determined to exploit our disaster and the tragic consequences of this event to pursue their own political agenda. And that is not only unfortunate, Mr. Chairman, it is also disgraceful and a slap in the face to the people of the Gulf Coast who are battling the effects of this disaster every single day. The oil is moving faster than the federal response. We need answers and we need leadership by the President. Unfortunately, we have neither, and Louisiana's people and ecosystem are paying the price. Thank you, and I yield back.
Chair recognizes Chairman Dingell.
Mr. Chairman, I thank you. I was very impressed. I have an admirable statement which I will insert in the record in the hope that everyone will find it useful reading. I was very impressed with the comments of my colleague. He's telling us the story of a tale of two presidents. He's only telling us the tale of one president, but he's got the two mixed. We are harvesting here a situation which is created by a long series of deregulatory actions taken by the prior administration. I had not intended to make a partisan comment today because I don't think this is a partisan matter, but it appears other members seek to do so. And I think there needs to be some correction. The reason for this mess in the Gulf is the fact that for a long period of time we were drill, baby, drill. And we had that as part of our national policy. We also had deregulatory actions. And we have found out the blessing of these deregulatory actions brought about an economic collapse in securities and in the national economy. And now we're finding that it works also on natural resources. And we're harvesting a policy of making it easy to do the drilling and other things without seeing to it that they're properly scrutinized or taken care of. This administration had little, if anything, to do with it. And they're proceeding as fast as they can because political pressures will tolerate no less. But the harsh fact of the matter is that we ought not be making a partisan fight out of this matter and rather seek to figure out how it is we're going to address the problem. I take offense at the comments just made. And I think it's time that we understand that we have to address this as a problem and not to run around and make a lot of pointless partisan criticisms of the current administration. The BP cut corners. The record will show. The climate was set where that could be done by the prior administration. And we're seeing a situation where not only could that occur, but that important statutes like NEPA, of which I just happen to be the author, were in good part disregarded. NEPA says whenever an action which has major impact upon the environment is taken, that there must be an environmental impact statement filed. The practice of the prior administration was to waive NEPA whenever it can. NEPA does happen to be onerous, but the reason it's onerous is it requires that you take care to avoid things that are going to be hurtful and bad with regard to the environment. So you've got to go out and identify them, and you have to go out and find out how you can best address them or minimize the hostile and adverse impact. So they went ahead and hurried the process where it became no longer a practice to apply that to all components of a government action like leasing. They had a big environmental impact statement, but they never went into the specifics of the particular drilling. And now we're finding that this has a major impact on the human environment, just that one hole that they're drilling. Now, having said these things, again, I repeat that what we should be doing is addressing the problem before us, not making a lot of partisan statements. BP is supposed to do the cleanup, and the government is scurrying around to see to it that it be done. The Minerals Service at the Interior Department did a poor job. Quite frankly, it had become almost as corrupt as Sodom and Gomorrah, and it had to be cleaned out. The president did appoint a new head, but regrettably, the new head had to be disappointed, had to be disposed of because she did not do the job needed doing. Now our attention is gotten, and we intend to do something about those matters. But again, it is time to address what went wrong and to understand that major problems exist, like the fact that BP doesn't have the capability to do what it is they should do, and they cut corners and save money instead of looking to the public well-being. I think we should now concentrate on cleaning up the mess and to seeing to it that it doesn't occur again, and not to engage in a massive partisan finger-pointing. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Chairman. Chair recognizes Mr. Griffin for 2 minutes.
For calling this important hearing today. My nephew leaves from a little small city in Louisiana and flies 90 miles by helicopter onto a big rig every month to work, and I grew up fishing the Gulf and traveling the oil canals of South Louisiana. I might say that one of the provisions of the bill to have unannounced site visits is going to be very difficult, as most helicopters are noisy, and we'll have to land on the rigs with the crew and an announced flight plan. So this bill certainly needs a lot of revision and a lot of thoughtfulness that it does not have as yet. I do not understand why we are here to discuss legislation to respond to a spill that is still in the progress of being investigated. The April 20th explosion left us all wanting answers, especially the families of the 11 who died in the accident. But just because we want answers and want to prevent this from happening does not mean that we should rush to pass sweeping policies. I might point out that BP is mentioned over and over again, and yet we've aimed a regulatory shotgun at the entire industry, even those with great safety records. This is a punishment for those who have been doing their work well. It is the duty of Congress to find out exactly what happened so that we can most effectively craft policy to prevent future incidents like this and protect the people that we are sent to Washington to represent. Our number one priority must be stopping the flow of oil, bringing the well under control, and being able to finish the investigation is the most important step toward being able to ensure safety when producing our valuable resources. This is a time for engineering and action, not for knee-jerk policy capitalizing on this crisis. I appreciate you coming today to testify. I look forward to your testimony, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Chair recognizes Ms. McNerney for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for calling this important hearing. I spent some of my career in the energy industry, and when a device is supposed to be a fail-safe device, it's supposed to fail safely. What happened in the Deepwater Horizon was a tragedy, but an avoidable tragedy. While I agree the investigation may be ongoing, it's clear that the blowout preventer did not prevent a blowout. We need to put the provisions in place as soon as possible to make absolutely sure that installation standards, testing procedures, and device requirements are met and followed, which will truly prevent this kind of failure in the future. I yield back.
chair recognizes the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Blunt.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this hearing on the Blowout Prevention Act of 2010. It's been 10 weeks since the Deepwater Horizon rig exploded and soon after sank into the Gulf of Mexico. While the main priority is clearly to stop the leak and focus on the cleanup, we can, I believe, simultaneously look for effective ways to prevent this type of catastrophe from happening and, frankly, to determine how this problem could have been prevented as it appears to have been preventable. We need to learn the right lessons from the disaster to ensure that we respond appropriately. Weeks ago, Mr. Chairman, I introduced legislation that would better prepare us in the future, doesn't turn over production of the Gulf to only the big oil companies, and still holds private companies responsible for the cleanup cost and responsible for the economic damages. The bill before us today is not without concern. Many of those have been mentioned already. I'm hopeful that we'll be able to address what seems to be an overly broad definition of a high-risk well and the citizen suits provision. Within the context of our national energy policy, we have the opportunity to examine and implement plans that strengthen our ability to produce domestic oil and gas in an environmentally safe manner, continuing in our pursuit of energy independence from foreign oil. We should be looking at what steps energy explorers and producers should be taking to ensure that American energy can be safely found and efficiently used in the future. I'm hopeful that this subcommittee can find ways to protect the environment and safely produce American energy, considering both the environmental and economic challenges we face along the Gulf today. To that end, Mr. Chairman, I look forward to working with you, the ranking member, and the chairman and members of the full committee as we try to move forward and find these solutions. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Great. We thank the gentleman. The chair recognizes the gentlelady from California, Ms. Capps.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for calling this morning's hearing. As the chairman said previously, the errors that led to the BP oil spill were identifiable and preventable. BP centered the well pipe for cementing with 6 braces, rather than the 21 braces recommended by its own cement contractor. BP used a method of constructing the well that has been criticized for being substandard, and when BP activated its blowout preventer, it failed to properly deploy. These and other facts point to a systemic breakdown by BP in the safety and management of its offshore drilling activities. But it's not just BP, Mr. Chairman. Time and time again, the entire industry has assured us that oil and gas drilling are safe. They said the technology had become so advanced that a blowout was highly unlikely, if not impossible, and they would be prepared in case it happened. Cozy relationships between the industry and its federal regulators were undoubtedly a part of the problem as well. So it's clear, the system regulating offshore drilling is broken, and if we don't do something about it, it could lead to additional failures. And that's why I support the bill before us this morning. It makes technological fixes to prevent another catastrophic oil spill. It raises safety requirements for BOPs and other safety equipment and practices during offshore drilling. In order to ensure the accountability of these regulations, the bill establishes an independent technical advisory committee, a very valuable resource which will be useful. Finally, the bill includes language that I authored to increase the civil and criminal penalties to those who violate the law. This is a good bill that will set us on a new and constructive path. But I think it's worth pointing out that, at the end of the day, no matter what changes we make, offshore drilling will remain a risky business. Accidents do happen, and the environmental and economic consequences of these accidents they're massive. And the deeper we drill in more complex ways, the more massive consequences result. The country deserves a better policy, a comprehensive policy to prevent oil spill disasters from happening again. So thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing and for advancing a bill to reduce the risks from offshore drilling. I yield back.
We thank the gentlelady. The chair recognizes the gentlelady from California, Ms. Bono-Mack.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Great. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Stearns.
Good morning, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank Mr. Upton for having this hearing, the Blowout Prevention Act. I think, like many members, I applaud many of the provisions that are contained in this legislation, such as requiring a more thorough response plan, increasing the civil and criminal penalties for those individuals who knowingly violate the law, implementing more stringent safety standards, and requiring the applicant to certify that they can drill a relief well in a timely manner. But I'm also concerned that some provisions of this legislation are too broad or even unattainable and may have been designed to simply prevent oil and gas development in the United States. For example, because it would be nearly impossible for a drill operator to determine whether a potential blowout would lead to substantial harm, the high-risk well designation would not only encompass all offshore oil and gas rigs, but could potentially encompass all onshore oil and gas rigs as well. Perhaps, Mr. Chairman, we should wait to see what the Commission, the results of their investigation before we pass legislation. And as we've seen before in the Cap and Trade Bill and the Chemical Security Bill, this legislation contains a citizen suit provision that would allow anyone to commence a civil action if they believe a company is in violation of this act. And because attorney fees are enumerated as potential remedy, it would incentivize trial attorneys to pursue litigation against anyone regulated under this legislation. I welcome the witnesses. I look forward to their testimony, and I hope in the future that we'll have regular order on this bill so we can work together to address some of the concerns that I've expressed and ensure that limited federal resources are used effectively to address the increased safety concerns with those wells that are truly at high risk. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
We thank the gentleman. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing on the Blowout Prevention Act of 2010. I appreciate both our panels for being here today and discuss our committee's proposed legislative response to the Deepwater Horizon disaster, and I look forward to your testimony. The legislation we have here to discuss is important, and I appreciate the chairman's effort to ensure our natural resources are safely produced and that the workers tied to this production are safe at all times, and we eliminate potential environmental risk. However, I have some concerns about how this will be accomplished in the bill and how reasonable some of the requirements and procedures established in this bill would be. It's important that we keep in mind that when our own subcommittee on oversight and investigations revealed numerous existing key safety precautions were neglected by BP prior to the Deepwater Horizon disaster and didn't even meet the standards of the American Petroleum Institute, the API. So again, I support the safety regulations being put in place where they're warranted and certainly enforcement ones on the books. There are numerous provisions that may be impossible to implement unless your goal is to eliminate drilling in our country, and that's my concern. One example in the bill on page 31, right at the top, it's, and I'll quote, an appropriate federal official. The term appropriate federal official means the Secretary of Energy, Secretary of Interior, or Administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency is designated as specific responsibilities provided in this act by the President of the United States. You need to have one agency. You don't have to have a revolving agency depending on who's the president. And I'd suggest we change that to the Department of Interior in consultation with the EPA and the Department of Energy, because the Department of Interior is reforming what they need to do. Although I guess since we have three agencies, we could even say the president can name a future draft choice. There are concerns I have. We need a balanced approach to this issue that ensures the safety of our workers and our environment while ensuring that our domestic producers, including the hundreds of small business tied to productions, remain viable. And again, Mr. Chairman, I hope to work with you before we go to markup and even before the full committee so we can actually get a bill that allows for production safely and responsibly of our natural resources, that if we don't produce them in the Gulf of Mexico, we're going to easily have to import them from other parts of the world. Now, I yield back my time.
Great. The gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Dr. Burgess.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, I never thought I'd see the day when you don't want a good crisis to go to waste become a governing philosophy, but it certainly seems to have now. I do question why the need for the haste with the hearing and the markup tomorrow when we haven't got all the facts in front of us. I'm particularly disturbed that yesterday our Committee of Oversight and Investigations was to have Secretary Salazar testify, but for whatever reason that testimony was pulled and the hearing postponed. You have to ask yourself, why is Secretary Salazar being kept out of the Committee of Oversight and Investigations? It sort of seems like a crude attempt at a witness protection program. Mr. Hayes, I look forward to hearing from you today. We didn't get your testimony until late last night. I was grateful to receive it. Some of the words literally leapt off the page, the third paragraph. Overall, given the level of detail contained in this draft, the administration will require additional time and analysis to fully address and assess the policy and the legal implications of its provisions before we can provide the subcommittee with a detailed position on this bill. I think that's well stated, and I only wish the committee had the foresight to comply with your request. You know, we heard from two women down in Chalmette, Louisiana, on a field hearing about this very issue. They were very concerned that what this committee might do would further cripple the economy of their communities. They said over and over again in ways that were extremely clear that they don't need to be crippled with new regulations, but someone needs to enforce the existing regulations. So why isn't the Department of Interior and whatever we're calling MMS today, why are they not enforcing the regulations as they should be or they should have been? Where were they? So far, the answers received can only suggest one answer. They were asleep at the switch. Today, we're going to look at this legislation. We're going to open the door for additional suits. As Mr. Green says, we're going to really, our only purpose is to regulate an industry that this Congress has been anxious to regulate for a long time. I only hope the damage that we do in the next several days is minimum. I will yield back the balance of my time.
I thank the gentleman very much. And just for the record, we invited Secretary Norton and Secretary Kempthorne of the Department of Interior, plus Secretary Salazar to testify. Secretary Norton and Secretary Kempthorne could not be here this week, and so it is our intention to have all three of them testify before the committee, but we did not, in fact, have that hearing because those two secretaries could
Will the gentleman yield
be
on that point for just one moment? Secretary Salazar has been testifying in front of other committees without a buffer from the previous administration with no difficulty. I see no reason why he can't testify in front of our Committee on Oversight and Investigations.
It was our judgment that a historical perspective is necessary in order to understand the totality of this issue. And again, our intention is to have that hearing, and we will do so, hopefully as soon as we come back from the 4th of July break. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Utah, Mr. Matheson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The goals of this draft legislation, the Blowout Prevention Act, are commendable, and I agree that all evidence points to the need for additional action to prevent future oil well blowouts that have led to the catastrophe we're seeing in the Gulf. However, I do have some concerns that the Blowout Prevention Act is moving very quickly through the legislative process without ample time to thoroughly understand the effect the requirements might have on future drilling operations both onshore and offshore. There are a number of questions that have been raised about this bill, which I hope can be addressed, or we can begin to address them during this hearing. Among the concerns or questions I have would be, what constitutes a high-risk well, and how many oil and gas exploration or production wells would be categorized as high risk? How will the requirements in this bill affect the permitting and leasing process for onshore activities on federal lands? How would the new federal requirements affect current state regulation of well construction? What federal agencies would be responsible for writing these rules? As you know, drilling a well in deep water is different from drilling one in shallow water, which is different from drilling in the Marcellus Shale Formation in Pennsylvania, which is different from a well in the Uinta Basin in Utah. How will this legislation provide flexibility for well construction design and safety requirements based on these distinctions and avoid an inflexible one-size-fits-all requirement? Again, those are a few questions I'd like to see if we could have answered, but I do want to express my appreciation that we have the chance to review this legislation. I do think we need to take appropriate steps, and I look forward to continuing to work with the committee to make sure we get this right. I'll yield back.
Great. Gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Whitfield.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much, and certainly we look forward to the testimony today. I think one of the themes that continues to occur in the federal government is that frequently we overreact, and particularly when we're dealing with complex issues as this is. And I agree with Mr. Mathis' comment about what is a high-risk well. We need to know that. And when you start delegating to giving the federal officials the authority to delegate their responsibility to the state, to approve the commencement of drilling. That appears to me an effort made to simply start making it extremely difficult to drill for oil within our territorial waters. And someone else raised the question, is our goal here to stop all offshore drilling? So I really think it's premature to move a bill this complex so quickly. We need expert testimony. We need to really delve into the impact of this kind of legislation. And then we certainly want these wells to be drilled safely, with precaution, maximizing the opportunity that there will not be a blowout. But I also noticed in here we have a $10 million criminal fine. We have 10 years in prison criminal penalties. So we don't need to be putting an unnecessary damper on the exploration for oil to help make our country less dependent upon foreign oil. We need to be doing things to maximize safety, but also encourage development. So I think we need to move with great caution on this legislation, and I look forward to the testimony and to the questions that are asked.
We thank the gentleman. The chair recognizes the gentlelady from California, Ms. Harmon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This committee is doing what it does best, regulating dangerous activity to protect the public. We have a recent history with toy safety, drug safety, auto safety, and now we're going to try to improve deep water drilling safety. I think that the draft bill is very good. Improvements, I'm sure, can be made. We're not rushing it out of here in 10 minutes. We have a discussion draft, and tomorrow we'll have a serious markup. But we will have additional witnesses, and the legislative process is the regular order. And the bill, I am sure, once it passes or when it passes, will be better. I personally would prefer no deep water drilling because I think it's inherently unsafe, but I recognize that there are regional differences among us. They're not partisan differences, they're regional differences. And I also feel a bit sheepish that I hail from the land of one person, one car. Let me just mention that at the markup tomorrow, I will offer an amendment, or hopefully it may be included in the manager's amendment if we have one, to study whether drilling a relief well or relief wells simultaneously with drilling the main well makes sense. One of my constituents suggested this idea, and it seems to me to make sense, and I'd like us to probe whether, as a matter of legislative policy, it makes sense. So I appreciate what you're doing, what we're doing, think it's consistent with the glorious history of this committee, and yield back the balance of my time.
We thank the gentlelady. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Hall.
Mr. Chairman, I will not use my time except to say that I've dealt with desperate situations like this before for all the years that I've been in politics, and I find that members of each party want to support their party's push or their party's thrust. Sometimes the penalty for not doing it is losing their committee or whatever. But I think, and the way we used to handle things like this in the Texas Senate, when anything this outrageous comes up that they're going to give civil penalty of $10,000, civil penalty is okay, but 10 years in jail. We'd send up an amendment, and I may do just that. Amendment to add on the death penalty there for the second time they do it, or add on for every person who is an employee of that company gets 10 years, or the prison there. That's how outrageous it can be. I yield back my time.
Great. Gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Melanson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Dingell, thank you for your comments. Gentlelady Bono Mac, at the opening hearing, thank you for your comments about keeping this thing from being bipartisan. Let's work together. I have problems with the bill. We need to work through it, but as always, I appreciate the work of my colleagues on this committee as well as the rest of the body. I want to thank the Judiciary Committee for the fine work that they've done on the Spill Act, which will come to the floor today, and I hope that you will all join me in supporting this great legislation that will give the 11 victims' families the right to recover some measure of compensation for the loss they have suffered. Today is the 72nd day of oil leaking into the Gulf of Mexico, and there's no defense or excuse for BP's inability to cap the oil well and stop this man-made disaster. But the panic you see from my constituents is because the damage doesn't stop when the well stops. The environmental impact of this leak will decimate our wetlands, leaving us even more vulnerable to summer storms and hurricanes which threaten to arrive any week. And we may never see our fisheries recover. As you have heard me say many times before, our livelihood and our way of life are slipping away. From each of us each day, this will continue to pollute our waters. I believe this is a time that demands action. I want to see BP throwing everything they've got at the problem. There will be times for PR and commercials later. I want to see the rest of the industry continuing to give unfettered support and resources to this disaster. After this leak is contained, this country will continue to demand affordable energy, and we intend in Louisiana to work hard and provide it for them. But we as a state and as a nation can never let this happen again. As has been mentioned in this committee before, it seems that the speed of exploration and innovation, great strengths in our country, left behind comparable research and development in the field of response and recovery. We are drilling with 21st century technology, but still using 20th century methods to contain and clean up the spill. Because our state and our people have committed to give so much to power the rest of this country, I think it is fair to ask that every company and every agency involved in offshore energy production cooperate and determine a safer path forward. I hope this hearing today plays a part in that discussion. We need to find a middle ground between drill, baby, drill, and a moratorium to keep the economy going in our area. And it's a difficult task for me to stand in oil up to my ankle asking for more oil, but it's important to our lives and our livelihoods. I yield back my time.
We thank the gentleman, and we thank the gentleman for his incredible work in Louisiana and the Gulf and the Congress on behalf of his people. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Barrow. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Vermont, Mr. Welsh.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, it's often said that Congress does two things. One, does nothing, and two, it overreacts. This is a time when I hope we get it right. This committee has provided some real leadership. The chairman took a bipartisan delegation to the Gulf shortly after this catastrophe occurred. And as the information has unfolded, in significant part because of the diligence of this committee, including the spill cam that made visible to all Americans what was spewing from the floor of the Gulf, it has allowed us to get more and more information about what happened. And in fact, when you get that information, it's clear that the BP cut every corner possible when it came to a choice between safety and saving money. And it's also clear that the government agency, the Mining and Mineral Services, did not do its job. And the whole point of the inquiry and the investigation was to find out what happened and what we can do to prevent this, both with better regulation that works on behalf of the environment and the people, and also safety standards that BP cut short. So this is timely, and I look forward to working with you, Mr. Chairman, and my colleagues on both sides of the aisle for Congress to get this right.
Okay, we thank the gentleman very much. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Gonzalez. And the chair recognizes the gentleman from New York, Mr. Engel. Is the gentleman's microphone on?
Sorry. Okay.
Great,
Thank you. In the wake of the tragedy, serious questions have been raised about the causes of the explosion and the adequacy of industry practices and regulatory standards relating to oil and gas drilling. We must take action to improve industry practices and strengthen regulatory standards to try to ensure that this never happens again. Before us today is the Blowout Prevention Act of 2010. The legislation establishes a number of standards and procedures to help ensure that the use of appropriate safety equipment and practices during high-risk oil and gas drilling activities. It's good legislation. I think it can be improved. In particular, I'd like to discuss with witnesses the addition of acoustic backup control systems and other emergency backup control systems. What really frustrates all of us is that we had been told time and time again that things of this magnitude really could never happen, and that if it did happen, there would be all kinds of safeguards in place. And we see now that that was really not the case. So I have a hard time believing oil executives when they give us reassurances that this is a once-in-a-lifetime thing and it can't happen again. I thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank you for pushing this bill. I thank you for the hearings we've had. I think the American people want to get to the bottom of this, are very, very upset with this. And obviously, this is a catastrophe of monumental proportions for our lifetime and generations to come. I yield back.
We thank the gentleman very much. All time for opening statements from the members has expired. We now turn to our witness, David Hayes. He is the Deputy Secretary of the Department of Interior. Deputy Secretary Hayes has played a leading role in organizing the administration's response to the BP oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico and is an expert on energy and natural resources policy. This is his second tour of duty at Interior. He also served as Deputy Secretary during the Clinton administration. Welcome back to the committee. Mr. Hayes, whenever you're ready, please begin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Ranking Member Upton, and members of the subcommittee. Let me apologize for being a few minutes late. We had a fender bender on the way, but no serious injuries, to be sure. I'm accompanied here by Steve Black, Counselor to the Secretary. Steve is a primary author of the 30-day report that I'll talk about a little bit that we provided to the President on May 27th, and that mirrors a lot of the points made in your proposed legislation. Let me just also say, Mr. Chairman, at the outset that we appreciate your leadership in this matter. We also appreciate the leadership of Chairman Waxman and the full committee. We want to continue to work with all committee members as we deal with this horrific problem, and it's in that spirit that we're here today. We endorse the aim behind the Blowout Prevention Act of 2010. In fact, many of its provisions are right in line with recommendations that we are now implementing administratively under the authority, the ample authority of the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act. And I will go through that briefly in a moment. I'd like to just take a couple of minutes, if I can, to give a little bit of context here in terms of how we are approaching these issues, and then return to your legislation and look forward to questions and answers with the committee. Just to step back and provide a little bit of context, Secretary Salazar recognized when he came in the door on January 20th with me and a small group that there were serious issues with the Minerals Management Service. At that time, the issues were associated with the revenue side of the organization and the scandal in Lakewood, Colorado. The Secretary took immediate action on the ethics side and on the prosecution side, and then in the succeeding months also looked at the regulatory underpinnings of the problem of revenue collection, and in fact proposed to, and we are now implementing, the abolishment of the royalty in kind program, because structurally it provided the impetus and the opportunity, if you will, for inappropriate relations between regulators and the regulated industry. We also, and the Secretary also, looked very hard at the Outer Continental Shelf and issues writ large. As the Secretary looked at a proposed new 5-year plan for the Outer Continental Shelf, we had 4 public hearings, 500,000 comments on all issues dealing with the Outer Continental Shelf. It led to a conservative approach that the Secretary and the President implemented in canceling lease sales in the Arctic because of concerns about spill response capability, and in taking some areas completely off the possibility of Outer Continental Shelf drilling, including Bristol Bay in Alaska, because of environmental concerns. As to deep water, the National Academy of Sciences was commissioned in the late fall to review the inspection program of the Minerals Management Service because we were concerned about the adequacy of that program. We also, in the 2 budgets we had prior to the accident, asked for substantial budget increases for the Minerals Management Service, and in particular, the inspection capacity of the Minerals Management Service. After the accident, of course, we have redoubled, tripled, and quadrupled our efforts to deal with the obvious problems that led to the accident, even as we continue to explore the root cause of it. In particular, the President asked the Secretary to deliver within 30 days a report that would suggest safety improvements that could be taken and should be taken immediately and also in the medium and long term to deal with, to increase the safety of offshore drilling. That report was submitted on May 27th, rather. It's a comprehensive report, and it's clear that your committee staff and you have reviewed it carefully because many of the concepts appear in the draft bill that you are reviewing today. Also, as you know, the Secretary and the President, within the last 10 days, announced a new head of the Minerals Management Service, Mike Bromwich, and the Minerals Management Service reorganization is proceeding. It's now the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, Regulatory, and Enforcement, and it's being divided into 3 parts that separate out the regulatory and enforcement and also the revenue sections. With regard to the bill before you, we look forward to working with you and members of the committee on the bill. The 30-day report that we put out and that Mr. Black in particular led has many of the same concepts. Certification of equipment, third-party review of equipment, new inspection and reporting requirements, new casing and cement design requirements, new fluid displacement procedures. These already are being implemented. We had a notice to lessees on June 8th that laid out immediate requirements. We are also doing emergency rulemakings. We have a 6-month process of rulemakings that will generate new rules under our current authority for secondary control system requirements, ROV interventions, new emergency backup control system inspection and implementation requirements, including blind shear rams, new testing requirements, new cementing, well control requirements. We are working very, very hard along these lines. We see many of the same themes in your legislation. We are proceeding under current authority and believe that we can and will implement many of the aims of your legislation. But we look forward to working with you as you proceed to markup and through consideration of the bill. We would be delighted to sit down with your staffs and review in detail where we are in our regulatory processes and help identify and have a dialogue with you with regard to any gaps you see or any complementary actions that you think would be useful to pursue. With that, Mr. Chairman, I'll close and look forward to answering any questions from the subcommittee.
Yep, we thank you very much, Mr. Hayes. The chair will recognize himself for a round of questions. Would you like Mr. Black to be able to make any comments, or is he there just to answer questions?
He's here to bail me out, Mr. Chairman, if necessary. Thank you.
Okay. We don't use bailouts anymore in this Congress. So. All right.
Yeah, we'll call it a
fair point.
Yeah. Who wants to be a millionaire? It's a lifeline. You know, make one call. Okay.
Yeah.
Mr. Hayes, in the past 2 months, we've learned just how unprepared the oil and gas industry is to deal with blowouts, especially those that occur deep beneath the surface of the ocean. We've learned that top hats, junk shots, and riser cuts can't stop the oil from flowing. We've learned that skimmers, boom, and fire can't stop the oil from washing ashore. We've learned that dispersants are themselves toxic. We've learned that hurricanes can completely disrupt even the overwhelming response efforts currently underway. We've learned that even the relief wells are not certain to work. In fact, when we had the 5 largest oil company CEOs in front of the committee a couple of weeks ago, they all agreed that when faced with a blowout like this, they really had no good solutions. Clearly, relying on the industry's ability to respond to a spill like this in the future would be an enormous mistake. Don't you agree that what we need to do is to take all necessary steps to prevent a blowout from occurring in the first place?
Absolutely, Mr. Chairman.
So what that means is basically the blowout preventers must be able to prevent blowouts. The wells must be able to be sealed so that oil and gas can't just gush into the ocean. The well design and operation must have the best and safest technology. Do you agree with that?
I do.
Mr. Hayes, do you agree that the department should be required to periodically update its regulations to ensure that safety requirements keep pace with any expansion of drilling and related risks?
I do, Mr. Chairman.
How do you propose that we would do that, Mr. Hayes?
Well, I think it's the kind of examination that we're proceeding with right now, where we take a comprehensive look at the status of the regulations and update them. One of the truths that we've seen from this incident is that the technology has advanced more quickly than the regulatory system, and the regulatory system has to keep up, certainly, if not lead the technology. So I'm not sure exactly what the appropriate time frame is, but there certainly has to be vigorous periodic updating of regulatory requirements.
Mr. Hayes, your testimony raises the question whether the Interior Department already has the legal authority to impose some of the requirements in the legislation now before us. It's true that current law requires the use of best available and safety technology that is economically feasible and cost justified. That is a very broad, open-ended standard that leaves the department with a lot of discretion. But from the congressional perspective, the critical questions are what the Interior Department has done with its broad discretionary authority and what the department may do with it in the future. Perhaps not under this administration, perhaps under an administration that looks more like the previous administration, which took an attitude of complacency towards safety. Mr. Hayes, isn't it true that notwithstanding the department's current legal authority, its safety regulations for offshore drilling prior to the Macondo well blowout were clearly inadequate?
I would say, Mr. Chairman, that the combination of the regulatory framework and the enforcement structure was inadequate. In terms of the regulatory approach, there are broad, the current regulations are actually quite comprehensive, both in terms of having performance standards, which are the approach that many other countries are taking, such as Norway, UK, et cetera, that have had major accidents, and a blending of prescriptive standards. What has been lacking, I think, is strong enforcement of those, but also clearly the kind of periodic review that you were referring to in your previous question and updating of the regulations, and that's underway.
So that authority was not used?
The authority certainly was not used to the extent that the law allows.
So isn't it true, Mr. Hayes, that if Congress does not establish adequate minimum standards for safety, there is a real risk that a future administration will again slide into complacency because there would be no minimum standard?
Well, I think some minimum standards certainly make sense, Mr. Chairman, and we are in the process of implementing the same through our regulatory process.
Thank you, Mr. Hayes. My time has expired. The chair recognizes the ranking member, the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Upton.
Mr. Chairman, what's the situation with votes on the floor?
The second bells have rung.
The second bells have already rung? Well, I would leave it to the discretion of the gentleman. If he would like to begin and end his questions in 5 minutes, I think we can do that. Or we can adjourn right now and come back. Okay, if that is the gentleman's wish, the committee will stand in recess until the completion of the roll calls.